The steel door closed with a sound like a judge's gavel, and I watched through the observation slit as Procurement Officer Vess turned the wheel 7 times, counterclockwise as protocol demanded. The air smelled of recycled moisture and something underneath it, something sweet and wrong that I would later understand was the beginning of rot. We had 37 days of rations for 42 people, and nobody had said anything yet, but I could see Vess's hands shaking as he made his marks in the inventory ledger. I was a junior logistics clerk in Subsector Administrative Complex Theta 9, which meant I counted things for people who counted things for people who reported numbers upward into a bureaucracy so vast that no single human mind could comprehend its full structure. When the orbital bombardment began, I had been filing requisition forms for water reclamation filters, forms that would never be processed, sent to offices that no longer existed, stamped by officials whose bodies were now vapor in the upper atmosphere. The cogitator banks in my office had continued their mechanical humming for 3 hours after the first impacts, dutifully processing data while the world above us burned. I had watched the duty roster print out assignments for personnel who were already dead, the machine spirits unable to comprehend that the names in their memory cores no longer corresponded to living flesh. The shelter had been designed for 30 people, maximum occupancy 35 in crisis conditions. We were 42. I knew this because I had counted us myself, twice, checking my figures against Vess's official tally. Both counts matched, 7 excess persons. The mathematics was simple, almost elegant in its cruelty. With strict rationing, 37 days of supplies for 42 people meant approximately 29 days before starvation began in earnest. Less if we accounted for the additional caloric requirements of stress, fear, the body's involuntary responses to sustained terror. The shelter was a standard model, reinforced rockcrete walls 3 meters thick, air recyclers rated for 40 years of continuous operation, water reclamation systems that could theoretically sustain a closed environment indefinitely, if properly maintained. The designers had thought of everything except the human element. They had calculated load-bearing tolerances and blast resistance coefficients, but they had not accounted for what happens to people when they realize they are living mathematics problems with only one solution. On the first day, we were still human, still capable of the small courtesies that define civilization. People spoke in hushed tones, shared their corner spaces, helped the elderly woman from archives find a place to sleep. Her name was Margaret, and she had worked in the record-keeping division for 43 years, filing reports that documented the filing of other reports. She told me once that she had never seen the same requisition form twice in all that time, each one unique, each one a small testament to some minor inefficiency or failure somewhere in the vast machine of governance. She had kind eyes. I mention this because it matters later. The air recyclers maintained a constant temperature of 18 degrees, which the technical manual assured us was optimal for long-term habitation. In practice, it meant we were always slightly cold, our bodies burning extra calories to maintain core temperature, accelerating the arithmetic of our consumption. I began to notice the cold most acutely in my fingertips, a persistent numbness that spread gradually up through my hands. By the 3rd day, I could no longer feel the stylus properly when I made my counts in the inventory log. Vess instituted the rationing schedule on the 2nd day. Each person would receive 1.2 kilograms of compressed nutrient bars per day, divided into 3 equal portions, plus 800 milliliters of reclaimed water. The nutrient bars had been manufactured 17 years ago in a forge complex whose designation I recognized from shipping manifests I had once processed. They tasted of chalk and rendered fat, with an aftertaste that suggested machine oil, though the ingredients list insisted this was impossible. We ate them anyway. We drank the water, which had been filtered through chemical beds and UV sterilization, but which still carried the faint psychological taint of knowing it had been other things, other fluids, before the machines made it clean again. I watched people eat with a kind of terrible attention. I could not help myself. I counted the bites they took, estimated the size of each portion, calculated whether they were consuming exactly their allotment or perhaps slightly more. This was my training asserting itself, the instinct to quantify, to measure, to reduce all phenomena to numbers that could be entered into columns. On the third day I noticed that Administratum Supervisor Kellen was taking slightly larger portions than his documented ration allowed. Perhaps 50 grams extra per meal, 60 milliliters more water. Over the course of a day, this meant 150 grams of food beyond his allocation. Over 10 days, 1.5 kilograms. The difference between someone else living or dying. I said nothing, this is important. I made the observation, performed the calculation, and said nothing. The shelter had been equipped with minimal lighting, low-output lumen strips that cast everything in shades of gray and amber. The designers had calculated that reduced visibility would extend the operational lifespan of the power cells. They had not considered what it does to human psychology to live in perpetual twilight, to lose the distinction between day and night, to have time become an undifferentiated flow marked only by the distribution of rations and the slow accumulation of waste in the chemical toilets. By the fifth day, people had stopped using names. We had become functions instead, the medicae, the tech priest, the senior administrator, the janitor, the three women from accounts, the old man who coughed, identity bleeding away into role, personality subordinated to utility. I was the inventory clerk, and people spoke to me only to confirm their rations or to report discrepancies in distribution. I had become a walking manifestation of scarcity, a human reminder of the mathematics that governed our survival. Margit from Archives began to smell on the sixth day, not the general unwashed smell that had begun to permeate the shelter. We had no water for bathing, and our bodies had started to produce the sour odor of fear, sweat, and metabolic stress. This was different, sweeter, organic. The tech priest examined her and reported that she had developed an infection in her lower left leg, some minor injury she had sustained during the evacuation now becoming septic. The Medicae supplies included antibiotics sufficient for perhaps 3 full treatment courses. Margit would require 1 complete course, possibly 2 if the infection had spread. The tech priest, his name had been Dalton, I remembered, though no one used it anymore, convened what he called a resource allocation meeting. 10 of us gathered in the section of the shelter designated for administrative functions, a space barely large enough for us all to stand without touching. Vess was there, Kellen, the Medicae, a woman named something like Thrasia, others whose names and faces had begun to blur together in my mind. "The infection is advanced," the Medicae said. Her voice was flat, carefully neutral. "Without treatment, sepsis will develop within 3 to 5 days. Death will follow shortly after." "And with treatment?" Kellen asked. 70% probability of full recovery, given a complete antibiotic course. "How long would the course take?" 10 days. Vess consulted his ledger, though I knew he had the figures memorized as thoroughly as I did. Treatment would consume 1/3 of our medical supplies, supplies which may be needed for other emergencies. Other emergencies? The Medicae's voice held a note of something that might have been anger, or perhaps just exhaustion. "She will die without treatment." "Yes," Vess said. "That's correct." Silence filled the space between us, heavy and thick as the recycled air. I could hear the air handlers in the walls, the soft mechanical breathing that sustained us. Could hear my own heartbeat. Could hear someone swallowing, the sound absurdly loud in the quiet. "She's 67 years old," Kellen said finally. "No specialized skills, archives division. Her caloric requirements are lower than average, but her labor potential is minimal." "You're suggesting we let her die?" The Medicae said this as a statement, not a question. I'm suggesting we consider resource allocation in terms of overall survival probability. Kellen's voice was carefully modulated, the tone one might use to explain a routine procedural matter. If we expend 1/3 of our medical supplies on a single individual with limited utility, we reduce our capacity to respond to future medical crises that may affect personnel with critical skills. Critical skills? The Medicae looked at each of us in turn. Who decides what constitutes critical skills? No one answered. The question hung in the air like smoke. We vote, Vess said finally. Those in favor of allocating medical resources to treat the infected individual indicate. I watched hands rise, counted them. 3. The Medicae. A junior technician whose name I had forgotten. One of the women from accounts. 3 out of 10, 7 hands remained down, mine among them. I have thought about this moment every day since, have tried to understand what I was thinking, what I told myself to justify the choice. I remember a kind of cold logical clarity, a sense that I was making a difficult but necessary decision based on objective data. The numbers supported it. The resource allocation models confirmed it. One elderly woman with minimal utility versus the collective survival probability of 42 people. The mathematics was unassailable. And Margit died on the 9th day. The smell grew worse first. The sweet rot smell intensified, spread, became impossible to ignore. We moved her to the far corner of the shelter, isolated behind a makeshift barrier of supply crates. The Medicae provided what palliative care she could: water, pressure dressings, words of comfort that sounded increasingly hollow. I did not visit her, could not. I maintained my inventory counts, my ration distributions, my careful documentation of every gram of food consumed and every milliliter of water allocated. On the 9th day, the smell changed, became sharper, more chemical. The Medicae said the sepsis had spread to her bloodstream, that toxins were overwhelming her kidneys and liver, that her body was beginning to poison itself. That evening, during the 3rd ration distribution, someone asked what would happen to Margit's remaining food allocation. Vess consulted his ledger. Deceased personnel forfeit future rations. Resources revert to general inventory. So we'll have more food? This from one of the technicians, a young man who had been growing visibly thinner, his uniform hanging loose on his frame, marginally spread across 41 remaining personnel. The increase per person is negligible. 41. I heard my own voice, detached and strange. She's not dead yet. Effectively she is. Kellen again, always Kellen. Her caloric consumption continues, but her contribution is nil. From a resource allocation perspective, she still counted in the total. I surprised myself with the force of my words. If we're doing this, if we're making these decisions, at least maintain accurate accounting. Vess marked something in his ledger. Noted, 42 personnel until death is confirmed. Margit died that night. I know because I was awake when the Medicae emerged from behind the supply crates, her hands stained with something dark, her face blank as parchment. She walked to the chemical toilet, washed her hands as thoroughly as our limited water allowed, then returned to her sleeping area without speaking to anyone. In the morning, Vess adjusted his ledger. 41 personnel. I calculated the new per-person allocation. 1.24 kilograms of food per day. An increase of 0.04 kilograms. The difference was barely perceptible, would have been invisible except to someone watching for it, counting it, measuring it with the desperate precision of the starving. The shelter's designers had included a corpse disposal system, a small cremation unit that could reduce organic matter to ash using a high-intensity plasma torch. It was designed for emergency sanitation, for dealing with disease vectors. The manual said nothing about using it for colleagues, for people whose names you knew, for elderly women from archives who had spent 43 years filing forms. The cremation took 6 hours. The smell was different from the smell of infection, sharper and drier, like burning hair and something underneath that reminded me of cooked meat. We all pretended not to notice, maintained our routines, distribution schedules, inventory counts, the small rituals that structured our days and prevented us from thinking too hard about what we had become. The ash went into a sealed container marked biological waste, awaiting disposal. Another piece of counting, another entry in the ledger. 0.8 kilograms of ash, roughly 13% of original body mass. I knew this because I looked it up in one of the technical manuals, unable to stop myself from quantifying even this. After Margit, the atmosphere in the shelter changed. Conversations became more sparse, more transactional. People stopped making eye contact. The small courtesies that had persisted through the first week evaporated. We were no longer 42 individuals sharing a space. We were a resource management problem, each person simultaneously a consumer of supplies and a potential threat to everyone else's survival. I began to notice the way people looked at the elderly, the injured, the less useful. Calculating looks, measuring looks. The same analytical gaze I'd been applying to food rations now directed at human beings. On the 14th day, one of the technicians, a man in his 50s with a chronic respiratory condition, developed a severe coughing fit that lasted most of the night. In the morning, I overheard Kellen and Vess discussing whether his oxygen consumption was affecting the air recycler efficiency, whether his condition might worsen, whether intervention would be worthwhile. The technician died on the 16th day. His death was attributed to respiratory failure, though the Medicai's expression when she announced this suggested the diagnosis was incomplete. I did not ask questions, did not investigate, simply adjusted my counts. 40 personnel, 1.29 kilograms of food per day per person. The pattern established itself. Every few days, someone would die, never the young and healthy, never those with critical skills, always the vulnerable, the elderly, the injured, the unnecessary. Sometimes the deaths had obvious causes, infection, chronic conditions, systemic failures. Sometimes the causes were less clear. Sometimes people simply stopped waking up, their bodies failing in ways the Medicaid could not or would not fully explain. I maintained my counts. This was my function, my role, the thing that justified my continued consumption of resources. I was useful because I could measure, because I could quantify, because I could reduce survival to mathematics and present it in neat columns that made terrible decisions feel rational. By the 25th day, we were 31 people. The rations had increased to 1.6 kilograms per person per day. Still not enough for comfort, but enough that the immediate threat of starvation had receded, enough that we might survive until rescue, if rescue came, if anyone was coming. The shelter's communication systems had been damaged during the bombardment. We could receive no signals from outside, could send nothing out. We existed in absolute isolation, cut off from any information about the world above. Sometimes I tried to imagine what was happening up there, whether the enemy had moved on, whether anyone was left alive, whether anyone remembered that subsector administrative complex Theta 9 had existed at all. But mostly I counted rations, counted personnel, counted days, counted the slowly increasing per-person allocations as our numbers diminished. On the 28th day, Kellen announced a new protocol. Henceforth, any person suffering from a potentially terminal condition, any person whose resource consumption exceeded their utility contribution, would be transitioned to palliative care only. No aggressive treatment, no consumption of scarce medical supplies, comfort measures, only until natural death occurred. The Medicaid objected. Kellen overruled her. Vess supported him. The vote was called. I raised my hand in favor, so did most of the others. The mathematics supported it. The resource models confirmed it. I was not a monster. I was a logistics clerk, following the numbers to their logical conclusion. The nightmares began around the 30th day. I would dream of counting, endless inventories of bodies arranged in neat rows, each one labeled and categorized and reduced to numbers in a ledger. I would wake in the gray-amber darkness, my fingertips numb from the cold, the taste of machine oil and chalk in my mouth, and for a moment I would not remember where I was or what I had become. By the 35th day, we were 23 people. The rations had increased to 2.1 kilograms per person per day. More than adequate for survival. We had food sufficient for another 47 days at current consumption rates. Medical supplies that would last months. Water that would last indefinitely, assuming the recyclers continued to function. We had saved ourselves. The mathematics had worked exactly as predicted. We had made the difficult decisions, maintained discipline, allocated resources according to rational principles. We had survived. I could no longer feel my fingertips at all. The numbness had spread up through my hands, into my wrists, a creeping absence of sensation that no amount of rubbing or warming could reverse. The medicae said it was peripheral neuropathy, probably caused by nutritional deficiencies or stress. She said it might be permanent. I did not ask for treatment, did not want to know whether treatment would be approved or whether I, too, had become a resource allocation problem to be solved. On the 39th day, the lights changed. Just slightly, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. The amber cast deepened, shifted toward red. The tech priest examined the power systems and reported that the main cells were depleting faster than predicted. We had perhaps 60 days of light remaining. After that, darkness. Can we reduce consumption? Kellen asked. We could switch to emergency lighting protocols. Reduce illumination by 40%. Do it. The lights dimmed. The shelter became a twilight space, shadows thick in every corner, faces reduced to vague shapes in the murk. It became harder to count, harder to see, harder to maintain the careful documentation that had been my purpose. I began to make errors in my tallies, small discrepancies that I could not locate or explain. Vess noticed, mentioned casually that perhaps the stress was affecting my performance, perhaps my utility was declining. I understood what he was suggesting, the same calculus that had been applied to Margit, to the coughing technician, to all the others. I was becoming a problem to be solved. That night, I checked the supply manifest one final time. We had food for 47 days for 23 people. If we were reduced to 22 people, the supplies would last 49 days. 2 extra days of survival purchased with 1 life. The mathematics was clean, objective, undeniable. I began to understand finally what we had done, what I had done. We had not made difficult but necessary decisions. We had not maintained order in crisis. We had transformed ourselves into a machine for converting lives into days, human beings into columns of numbers, dignity and compassion and everything that made us human into fuel for a few more rotations of the clock. And the machine had worked. That was the horror of it. The cold, undeniable horror. The mathematics had been correct. Every decision had been justified by the numbers. Every death had extended survival. We had applied perfect logic to arrive at the most evil possible outcome, and we had done it with ledgers and resource allocation meetings and careful documentation. On the 41st day, I noticed that I was no longer being called to ration distribution meetings, that my opinion was no longer solicited for resource allocation decisions, that people had stopped meeting my eyes entirely. I had become what Margit had been, surplus, unnecessary, a consumption problem awaiting solution. I could have fought, could have made myself useful, demonstrated value, argued for my continued survival. Instead, I found myself thinking about the observation slit in the main door, the one Vess had turned away from on that first day. I began to spend time there, staring through the narrow opening into the absolute darkness beyond, imagining what was out there, whether the world above still existed, whether anyone would ever find us, whether anyone should. On the 43rd day, I stopped eating. Not dramatically, not as protest or statement, simply stopped. picked up my ration at distribution, carried it to my sleeping area, sat with it for the prescribed meal period, then deposited it uneaten into the waste receptacle. The medicae noticed first, asked if I was ill. I told her I was not hungry. "You need to maintain caloric intake," she said. Her voice was tired, flat, the voice of someone who had said these words many times and no longer believed them. Why? She had no answer for that. Or rather, she had the answer, but we both understood it too well to speak it aloud. I needed to maintain caloric intake so that I could continue performing my function, so that I could remain useful, so that I could justify my consumption of resources, but my function was failing. My fingers too numb to write clearly, my counts increasingly unreliable, my utility declining toward the threshold where I would become a problem instead of a solution. Vess approached me on the 45th day. "You're not eating," he said. "No, you should eat." "Should I?" He opened his mouth, closed it. In the dim red-amber light his face looked hollow, skull-like, the face of a man who had calculated himself into something less than human. "The counts need to be maintained," he said finally. "I've trained someone, the girl from accounts. She can do the counts. That's not—" He stopped, started again. "You should eat," he repeated, but the conviction was gone from his voice. I did not eat. With each distribution I accepted my ration, carried it away, disposed of it. The waste receptacles began to fill with uneaten nutrient bars, perfect compressed rectangles of chalk and fat, small monuments to my refusal. On the 47th day, Kellen convened a meeting. 10 people gathered in the administrative area, though I noticed I was not invited. I watched from my corner as they spoke in low voices, occasionally glancing in my direction. The meeting lasted perhaps 20 minutes. When it ended, the medicae approached me. "They want to know if you're trying to kill yourself," she said. "No." "What are you doing then?" I thought about this, tried to find words for the thing that had been growing in me, the understanding that had crystallized into certainty. "I'm removing myself from the equation," I said finally. "That's the same thing. No, suicide would be a taking, an action, a choice that imposes on the group. This is just subtraction. I consume nothing. I take nothing. I stop being a variable in someone else's calculation. They're discussing whether to force-feed you, whether your continued survival is worth the resource investment." I almost laughed. The idea that they would spend resources to sustain someone who was trying to stop consuming resources, the perfect logical circle, the snake eating its tail. "What do you think?" I asked. She looked at me for a long moment. In the dim light I could not read her expression. "I think you're the only honest one left," she said finally. "I think you understood what we became, and this is the only moral response possible. Will you help them if they decide to force-feed me?" "I don't know." She walked away. I returned to my observation of the door, the narrow slit opening onto darkness. My fingers were completely numb now, the absence of sensation spreading up my forearms. Soon I would not be able to grip anything, would not be able to write, would lose the last vestige of utility that justified my existence. On the 49th day, I felt the numbness reach my elbows. My hands had become foreign objects, distant and unresponsive. I could no longer manipulate the stylus, could not make marks in ledgers, could not perform the counts that had been my function. I had finally achieved it. Complete uselessness, absolute superfluity, the state that justified removal. But they did not remove me, did not gather for a vote, did not convene a resource allocation meeting. They simply looked away, stopped acknowledging my presence. I had become invisible, a ghost haunting the corner of the shelter, neither fully alive nor fully dead. A mistake in the counting, a rounding error in their calculations. I understood then the final cruelty. They were allowing me to complete my own subtraction, to remove myself through attrition. It was more efficient this way. No moral weight, no decision to be made, no hands to be raised in vote. Just a natural process, a conclusion reached through passive acceptance. By the 52nd day, I could no longer stand. The numbness had spread to my legs, or perhaps it was simply weakness from lack of food. My body had begun consuming itself. breaking down muscle and fat to sustain critical functions. I lay in my corner, watching the dim red light pulse with my heartbeat, counting the seconds between breaths. The Medicae visited me once more, knelt beside me, checked my vitals with professional detachment. "Your kidneys are failing," she said. "Probably your liver too, maybe 3 more days, 4 at most. And then you'll be the 23rd person I've watched die in this shelter. 24th if you count yourself. Do you count me? I don't know anymore. I don't know what counts, what matters, what any of this means." She stood to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. About Margaret, about the vote. You voted to treat her, yes, and I'm still here and she's ash in a sealed container. What does that say about the value of moral positions, about the worth of being right when being right accomplishes nothing?" She walked away. I listened to her footsteps fade, counted them, 13 steps from my corner to hers, and then returned to my observation of the darkness beyond the door. My breathing had become shallow, irregular, my heart arrhythmic, missing beats, stumbling over its rhythm like someone losing count. On what I believe was the 55th day, my time sense had begun to fracture, moments stretching and compressing without pattern. I heard sounds from beyond the door, mechanical sounds, drilling, cutting, the shriek of metal on metal. Others heard it too. I watched them gather at the door, pressing against it, calling out, "Rescue!" Someone was cutting through from outside. We were saved. The door opened slowly, the wheel turning clockwise this time, the seal breaking with a hiss of equalizing pressure. Light flooded in, real light, white and pure and achingly bright after so long in the red-amber dimness. Figures in hazard suits entered, carrying atmospheric sensors and bioscanners. I heard voices, official voices reading from prepared statements. The all clear had been sounded, the enemy had withdrawn, the surface was habitable again. Subsector Administrative Complex Theta 9 had sustained 97% casualties, but the shelter survivors would be evacuated immediately for medical assessment and debriefing. I watched from my corner as they counted us. 22 personnel, they announced. 22 survivors from an initial population of, they consulted their records, 42 registered shelter occupants. A survival rate of 52%, they said. Remarkably high given the conditions. Evidence of excellent crisis management and resource allocation. They did not count me. My corner was shadowed, my body small and still, and in the chaos of evacuation, I was overlooked. An error in the accounting, a discrepancy in the manifest. 23 survivors, but they recorded only 22. I could have called out, could have made myself known, but I found I could not speak, could not move, could not make the effort required to correct their count. I had spent 55 days learning to unmake myself, to subtract my presence from the world, and the lesson had taken root too deeply to reverse. As they led the others out, Vess clutching his ledger, Kellen walking with the careful dignity of someone afraid of shattering, the Medicae moving like a woman in a dream, I remained in my corner, watching through the open door as they filed out into light and air and the world that continued beyond our mathematics. The last figure paused at the threshold, turned back, saw me finally, a shape in the shadows that did not match the inventory. "Sir," the figure called out, "there's one more." Footsteps returning, voices consulting. The count had been wrong, 23, not 22, an error in the initial assessment. They would need to revise the documentation. They lifted me, my body weighed almost nothing, had been reduced to numbers and angles, the minimum necessary structure to sustain the ghost of consciousness. They carried me toward the door, toward the light, toward air that had not been breathed 42 times and filtered through machines. I wanted to tell them, wanted to explain what we had done, what we had become, how we had transformed survival into a moral catastrophe, wanted to confess the votes, the calculations, the terrible logic that had reduced human lives to entries in a ledger. But my voice was gone. My counting was done. And as they carried me out into the light, I looked back one final time at the shelter, at the grey walls and chemical toilets and neat rows of sleeping areas, at the sealed container marked biological waste, at the ledger Vess had left behind, its pages filled with perfect documentation of our descent. They recorded it as a success. 23 survivors, excellent resource management, commendations recommended for the senior personnel who maintained order during crisis. The official report praised our discipline, our adherence to protocol, our rational allocation of limited resources. The report was filed, processed, forwarded up through layers of bureaucracy to officers that recorded it without reading, archived it without understanding. It became another entry in another ledger, one more piece of data in a system too vast for human comprehension. And somewhere in that system, someone counted the survivors, 23, and marked it as a positive outcome, evidence that protocols worked, that procedures should be maintained, that the mathematics of survival justified any cost. I recovered eventually. The numbness receded. The kidney function returned. The body's remarkable capacity for healing asserted itself. I was returned to duty after 3 months of medical leave, assigned to a new office in a rebuilt complex, given new forms to process and new counts to maintain. I perform my function. I quantify. I measure. I reduce phenomena to numbers and enter them in columns. This is what I am trained to do, what I am useful for, the reason I justify my continued consumption of resources. But sometimes, in the moments between sleeping and waking, I return to that corner of the shelter. I feel the cold in my fingertips. I taste chalk and machine oil. I hear the mechanical breathing of the air recyclers and the sound of a door closing with the finality of a judge's gavel. And I count. I count the 20 people who did not leave the shelter alive. I count the days we survived. I count the votes, the raised hands, the decisions recorded in ledgers and justified by mathematics. I count the cost of being right when being right means being monstrous. I count, and I understand now what I could not understand then, that some additions are subtractions in disguise, that survival is not the same as living, that the worst horrors are not the ones that violate logic, but the ones that fulfill it perfectly. They locked the shelter after counting the supplies. We counted ourselves down from 42 to 23. And when they unlocked it again and counted us out, they called it a success. The counting continues. It always continues. That is the nature of bureaucracy, of systems, of the vast machinery of governance that grinds on regardless of what it consumes. I'm inventory clerk 77 Theta, reassigned and functioning. I maintain accuracy in all my tallies. I submit reports on schedule. I fulfill my function within acceptable parameters, and every night I count the dead and call it survival.